All right, part two. My break ended up being all of the rest of that day, so I'm actually recording this the morning of the day you guys are going to hear it. Again, sorry for the wonkiness of this. This will hopefully be the only time we have to do this. I should be good to come in by Thursday. I'm actually already feeling a decent amount better, but I gotta wait for the antibiotics to reduce my contagiousness before I could ethically come in, I think. So, all right. We left off with 1955, I believe. Let's go back. Yeah, Montgomery Bus Boycotts. So we're picking up from 1960. And as you hopefully saw from the timeline, 1960 is the year where we get sit-ins. This is also going to be the year where we get a lot of stuff coming out of Snick and really them starting to actually exist as an organization. So we'll get into that as well. Sit-ins did actually occur on a much more limited basis before 1960, but 1960 is when they really like appeared at the forefront and became a really big deal. There were a bunch of sit-ins throughout 1960, and then there were some that happened afterwards, but not nearly as much. So 1960 is definitely like our year for sit-ins. And this all starts pretty early in the beginning of the year, February 1st of 1960. There were four college students known as the Greensboro Four. You can see them in this picture right over here on the side. They decided that they liked what MLK was doing and they wanted to take a stand against segregation. And they decided that the next area they wanted to target were these things called lunch counters. Lunch counters are things that we don't really have too much of anymore, but especially like in the Midwest, for example, they can still find them. Sorry, coughing. Basically, it's what it looks like in this picture here. You sit down, you order, and you have lunch at the counter, and then you leave. And lunch counters, like so many other things, were segregated. As you can see in this photo here, it's okay for a black person to work at the lunch counter, but they would not serve black people at the lunch counter. So these Greensboro Four went to this place called Woolsworth. I'm pretty sure it's Woolworth. And they decided they're going to sit down. They're going to order food. They're going to be denied the right to service, obviously, and then they're just going to refuse to leave. They're just going to literally sit in there. They're going to sit and wait and demand to be served. They would continue to do this every single day until change occurred. And much like we saw with MLK, they're really going to be relying on media attention to do this. Because obviously, four dudes hanging out at a lunch counter, it's not going to have the biggest effect unless people start paying attention. And people do start paying attention. What we see is a massive swelling in the size and scope of these protests to the tune of about 1,000 protesters by the time we get to February 6th. So not even a week later, and they've gone from 4 people to about 1,000. They have also spread out at this point, not just from that one lunch counter. They've started targeting multiple lunch counters because I don't know if you could see from this picture. I'm pretty sure you're good enough at counting to realize there's not 1,000 seats at this one. They wouldn't all be seated. They would just kind of file in and take up space, but you're still not fitting 1,000 people in there. There's my daughter being my daughter in the background. I actually can't go talk to her because I don't want to give her pneumonia either, so I just have to stay away. It sucks. So, continuing on with sit-ins. As this movement grows, other stuff starts coming out of it. It becomes that it's not just a sit-in, there's also a boycott that comes out of it. As I mentioned before, the sit-in grows to different locations, to more people. By July of that same year, 1960, the store, Woolworth, had lost approximately $200,000 in business. If you adjust for inflation to 2019, which is not quite this year, but it's close enough, that is $1.7 million of business that they have lost out on. Obviously, not just from the sit-in, the boycott as well. But that is going to be a huge impact on them. And at the end of the day, businesses care about money more than pretty much anything else. That is the role of a business, right? So this is enough economic damage to them that actually start to quietly serve black customers. They don't make a huge deal about it. They don't want to publicize they've caved to this, but they also don't want the sit-in and boycott to continue. So they're going to to acquiesce to the demands of the movement. So very successful from February to July. They are able to get what they're looking for. Again, this is not the first sit-in, it's not the only sit-in, it's not the last sit-in, but it is the most notable because it kicks off a bunch of, I guess you would say, copycat movements of responsive sit-ins throughout the nation, all throughout 1960, especially once you hit spring of that year. Once this sit-in movement is actually like kind of picking up steam, we're going to start seeing a lot of it. Unfortunately, as with all of these actions, we're going to see counter protests occur, people that are not happy with the idea of black customers being served at these lunch counters. The reactions to the protests did often get violent, including, for example, a bomb threat on the original sit-in on February 6th, which forced a change of location for that day until they came back the next day. Otherwise, there's a lot of people attacking them, throwing stuff at or on them, police threatening them. So there is a lot of danger that comes with these sit-ins. However, especially once the Snick starts getting involved, since they were inspired by MLK, nonviolence is going to be kind of core to what they're doing here. And they actually, before they go to the sit-ins, the student protesters get together and they actually train in nonviolence. They have simulations of if a counter protester attacks you, what do you do? And how do you respond to it? They practice just going limp if somebody tries to drag you off the chair. That way you're not fighting back, but you're making it harder for them. Obviously, the media is a huge part of this, and this is a common trend in the civil rights movement. You need media attention to make people sympathetic to your cause. If you fight back against the counter protesters, think about how you're going to be portrayed. You're going to be portrayed as, oh, these violent black protesters are fighting against these white protesters, and you become the bad guy because society in the 1960s is ready to see black people as the bad guys. If, however, you are a bunch of peaceful victims, you're not doing anything wrong, the only people that are doing things wrong are the people that are against you, it's going to be very hard for the average person to see you as a bad guy. And although American society is ready to see black people as the bad guy in the 1960s, if they are presented with a narrative where that's not possible, they will, a lot of them, actually sympathize with the black protesters. So that nonviolence is incredibly important to the success of these kinds of movements. So we can see here, this is an example. This, by the way, is actually legally assault, and it remains so to this day. Seeing the videos of people throwing drinks at people or spitting on people, that actually counts as assault, and you could be arrested for that, especially the spitting on them one. Another thing to notice about this one is we are starting to see, that's a non-black protester right there. There are going to be an increasing number as we move through these years of non-black civil rights protesters. So they're starting to get support from other groups, which is going to be very helpful for the movement as well. Sorry, I got a cough. Oh man, I can't wait to get better. All right. So this is also, of course, where we're going to get Snick coming out of this. Snick is often presented as being a youth branch of the SCLC, and it is true that the SCLC kind of got the meeting together that created it, but they very clearly from the get-go wanted to make themselves distinct and separate from the SCLC. So student representatives from 12 states, as well as representatives from CORE, SCLC, that kind of other organizations, they met up at Shaw University in North Carolina in April of 1960 as, this sit-in movement is starting to gain steam. And they formed this group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The idea here is they want to harness the energy and the passion of these young college students that want to protest, and maybe can be a little bit more dynamic in the way they do it or the things they're focusing on. So Snick comes out of this idea of organizing students as protesters. And as we've already established, it's always those damn young people that are out there protesting, that are out there causing problems, that are really going to be, affecting change here. I'm getting paranoid for a second that I'm not recording, so I'm gonna give you guys a peek behind the curtain here. It looks to me like it is recording, so we're gonna go right back to that. Okay, gotta cough again. Sorry. So Snick is, as I mentioned, going to pretty quickly try to differentiate itself and become its own distinct organization. Obviously, sit-ins are where they're going to start at, but we're going to see freedom rides, we're going to see March on Washington involvement, we're going to see Freedom Summer, other voter registration movements as well. All of that is going to be some pretty key nonviolent stuff Snick does. However, unfortunately, Snick is one of the organizations that moves from nonviolence to violence throughout its career as an organization. You can see down here in the bottom left, actually, Snick originally had both black and white members. But this guy on the right here, Stokely Carmichael, was going to gradually embrace the idea of black power. And black power, a big part of that was separationism, the idea that segregation is actually good as long as it's being done on terms that like the black community gets to decide. So as we get to the mid-1960s, Stokely Carmichael, in charge of Snick, actually steers it away from nonviolence into the idea of black power, into the idea of no more white members. Eventually, all the white members of Snick are going to be kicked out, and he's going to turn it into a more radical organization. And at that point, it's going to stop being as effective because, as we'll talk about in part 2 of the timeline, violent protest is not nearly as effective as nonviolent in the case of the civil rights movement. One final kind of timing thing to point out, we talked about Emmett Till in part 1. Thinking about Snick, when it forms in 1960, Emmett Till was 14. He was killed in 1955. How old would these freshman and sophomore college protesters have been when Emmett Till was murdered? Give you a second to do the math in your head. Hopefully you came up with the answer that they would have been about Emmett Till's age. And this is not just supposition on my part. A number of these college protesters brought this up. The fact that they were the same age as Emmett Till when he died, and his death made national news because of the nature of it, that had a huge impact on them and the way they viewed America and the way they viewed the civil rights movement. So it's not a coincidence that in 1960 you suddenly have all these young college people that are looking to be more proactive in the civil rights scene. Emmett Till's murder is once again actually really important here. It really does demonstrate the power of a martyr. Emmett Till wasn't even intending to be a martyr for the movement, but the fact that his death became so widely known and so publicized is going to have a kind of ripple effect throughout the civil rights movement. 1961 then. So year after sit-ins, all the sit-in stuff, for the most part, is going to wrap up by like fall, winter of 1960. And we're going to kind of move focus to something else, which is going to be some bus travel. So some background on this one, a few court cases. So first we have Morgan v. Virginia in 1946. Sorry, got a cough. So a Virginia law is going to be struck down by the Supreme Court because it is once again in violation of those constitutional rights. It required racial segregation on commercial interstate buses. This obviously would clash a lot with, for example, the 14th Amendment. But the key here is interstate buses. So really quick reminder, if you don't remember from AP Gov, there's a weird kind of gray area when it comes to who controls trade and commerce in America. If it goes on entirely within one state, it's generally easier for that state to argue that it is a states' right issue. But anytime there's a business that operates between states, interstate, it has generally been agreed and confirmed multiple times throughout American history and in the Constitution itself that interstate commerce is the purview of the federal government. So basically, Virginia tries to get around this. The Supreme Court goes, no, that is not your power as a state. That's a federal issue. And they are going to strike it down. And that's what it means by the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Enter Irene Morgan, who's riding a Greyhound bus from Hayes Store in Gloucester? Sure, Gloucester? Whatever that county is, in Virginia to Baltimore, Maryland. And she was told to give up her seat for a white person. She said, no, this is an interstate bus. Notice that it's going from Virginia to Maryland. Therefore, there is no segregation on this bus, and I will not move. She is arrested and convicted for her crime, air quotes, of refusing to give up her seat to a white person. This is argued up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finds that the Commerce Clause did not support state laws that regulate commercial interstate passenger travel. So they overthrow that Virginia state law. This is relevant in a second. Don't worry. I know it seems a little bit unconnected. Next up, we've got Keyes v. Carolina in 1955. So we're jumping ahead a little bit here. This one, take note, 1946 is before the Montgomery Bus Boycott, but 55 would have been while all this was going on. Sarah Louise Keyes, actually, as you can see, a military member, was traveling from Fort Dixon in New Jersey to her family's home in Washington, North Carolina. Again, that means interstate travel. There's no problem with the original bus driver, but there's a stop to change drivers, and she's told that she needs to give up her seat to a white Marine, we're noticing a trend here, and move to the back of the bus. Keyes goes, no, this is an interstate bus. I don't have to move. The new driver, emptied out the bus, says nobody else is getting in this bus until this woman does what she's supposed to do. He bars Keyes from entering it, and just refuses to let her do anything. She demands to know why she can't ride the bus, and in response, she is arrested. The ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, ends up ruling on this, and they say that this violates the Interstate Commerce Act. Again, you cannot segregate in interstate travel. It's a federal issue, and the federal government has decided that it's not allowed. Our last background then, and hopefully you see we're kind of establishing a pattern here. At the time we get to our 1960, 1961 time period here, we've been looking at court precedent for a decade and a half stating that you cannot segregate on interstate travel. So Boynton v. Virginia is going to be something that kind of kicks off our 1961 event here. Bruce Boynton is an African-American law student. He gets a bus ticket with this bus called Trailways, and it's going from Washington, D.C. to Montgomery, Alabama. It's supposed to go through Richmond, Virginia, and there's a 40-minute scheduled stop. So clearly this is a very much an interstate thing. We've got D.C., Alabama, and Virginia all the same kind of quick rundown here. The issue, though, isn't necessarily going to occur on the bus. What happens is, on that 40-minute scheduled stop, Boynton goes into the segregated restaurant in the bus station and sits on the white side of the restaurant. The staff at the restaurant, including originally his waitress and then a manager, come up to him and say, hey, you can't sit here. You need to go to the other side of the restaurant. And Boynton says, well, actually, I'm an interstate bus passenger, and because I'm interstate, that means that you cannot refuse me service because the federal government has said that you can't segregate like this. The restaurant obviously is going to disagree with that. Got a cough, hold on. They end up calling the police. The police officer shows up. He arrests Boynton. He is tried and convicted. He's fined. And then he argues his case. It again goes up, and it is found to be violating the Interstate Commerce Act. They actually agree with Boynton. They argue that maybe on a state level it's okay to segregate because if it was just a Virginia restaurant serving Virginia people, whatever. But Boynton was a interstate customer. And because it was a bus terminal restaurant and he was on an interstate bus, that means that it applies to the Interstate Commerce Act and they can't do that. So this kicks off then the idea of wanting to make sure that this is actually enforced. Because think back to Brown v. Board. Remember, just because that case was won in favor of integration doesn't mean that integration actually happened. So a really important part of the civil rights movement is going to become testing changes, testing, wins, victories to make sure they're actually happening. So it is, I did actually forget about this slide. It is relevant to bring up one more background thing, which is CORE. CORE has actually been around for a while at this point. They were founded in 1942. They were, much like MLK, inspired by Gandhi's ideas of nonviolent resistance, and they had been doing stuff since 42, but with pretty limited success. In 1960, they got the idea to repeat something they had done in the past. They had first attempted the idea of a Freedom Ride campaign in 1947, but it wasn't as effective. There wasn't as much support. There wasn't as much civil rights stuff going on. So they wanted, now that all this new stuff is coming out, especially with Boynton, to try again. Snick, being a new organization, decides they want to get on this as well. So they're going to join the campaign on May 4th of 1961, and everything's going to get kicked off at that point. So we have CORE and Snick working together on this. CORE is going to continue to be involved in nonviolent stuff until the mid-1960s, but then, much like Snick, unfortunately, they're going to drift more to the Black Power side of things and become a more aggressive, violent group. Sorry for coughing into the mic there. Sometimes the coughs are not expected. I hope, by the way, that you guys have seen The Goonies, and this is not just like a super weird meme that makes no sense to you. Maybe. So, freedom rides themselves then. Basically, what is going on here is a very simple core concept, which is that it's pretty clearly established at this point that the Supreme Court and the federal government has ruled that interstate bus travel is not segregated. It is integrated, and there is nothing that any individual state can say about that. It's been decided multiple times. So CORE and Snick want to make sure that this is actually being enforced the way it's supposed to. So they get a bunch of black and white activists together. Remember, Snick at this point is still black and white, as is CORE. And obviously, it wouldn't work out very well as a protest if it was only black people on the bus, because the whole point is the bus is integrated. So they get black and white students, they hop on these buses, and they decide that they are going to go through the South and see if there's any trouble that comes up, because in theory there shouldn't be, because it's been established that there is no segregation on interstate transport, again in theory. So there's multiple buses that are going to end up going for the freedom rides, and we'll kind of look at a map of that later. But the one that we're going to focus is going to go through the South and end with a rally in New Orleans, Louisiana. The idea here is that there's probably going to be some kind of confrontation. You get media attention in the confrontation, and that's going to push the current president, JFK, to do something, to be more proactive in enforcing this and making it happen. Because they're not dumb. They know that integrated interstate travel in the South is not being the reality. So they're trying to get people to realize that. So they leave from Washington, D.C. They have 13 riders originally. Got a cough, hold on. But they will gather more riders over time. And they still want to show off that the South is still segregated. Unfortunately, the violence that they are met with is much more intense than they had expected. A mob of heavily armed people mobs the bus. At first, they actually barred the doors and wouldn't let anybody on the bus out. They set it on fire and were basically forcing the passengers to burn alive inside of it. Well, die of smoke inhalation would have happened first, probably. Luckily for the people on the bus, the mob kind of dispersed, and they were able to open the doors and escape off the bus without any serious injuries happening. Although obviously people get really bad smoke inhalation, there's a lot of like PTSD kind of stress stuff coming out of it. So this massive attack on this bus is much more than was expected, and they run into a few problems. Big problem number one is the bus driver didn't actually sign up for these freedom rides. The bus driver was just a bus driver, and he basically said, like, I'm not driving them. I'm not going to risk my life so that they can prove a point. I'm not on board with this. Even some of the protesters didn't want to be on the bus anymore. They didn't want to be a part of the freedom rides anymore. So they did run into that. However, the media attention and the public backlash that happens from this, because these people almost murdered a bus full of people just for trying to legally drive through the South. This isn't like, the Montgomery bus boycotts where they're technically violating the law. They are doing what is within their legal right, and they're almost being killed for it. So this is going to horrify the country, and JFK is going to be kind of forced into taking action. JFK was really weird when it came to civil rights because he often talked positively about civil rights, and there's a lot of signs that he supported civil rights, but he also really wanted the support of Southern Democrats. And a big part of that was in not taking action on civil rights. So he was a really weird in-between dude when it came to actual civil rights stuff. And then obviously he was assassinated before we could actually see what he would have done long-term with the civil rights movement. So regardless, in this case, he is going to be forced into action. Federal troops are sent in to basically guarantee as much as they can the safety of the Freedom Riders. They are basically set up along the route of the Freedom Ride to make sure that they're not being harassed. They are set up in towns to make sure that the southern towns are following federal law and not harassing or doing anything legally to these riders. It's not just protection of the Freedom Riders that results from this, though. You also have the Interstate Commerce Commission stepping in again, saying that, all right, just in case it hasn't been clear, we are officially prohibiting segregation in all interstate transportation, buses, trains, like what have you, anything, it cannot be segregated interstate. The Justice Department also steps in, so we get another layer of this, suing local communities that had previously not complied and going forward refused to comply with these laws. So this is yet another example of people that are trying to stop integration actually very much accelerating the cause of integration through violence and trying to shut down these actions with terror. So we can see, again, our map here, multiple different rides going on. Hold on, I got a cough. I'm sorry. Some of these are pretty significant. Like, for example, here in Jackson, Mississippi, 306 jailed. So again, nobody's actually breaking any laws here. They are riding on buses interstate, integrated, which the federal government has said multiple times they're allowed to do, but you could see the need for kind of pushing federal action to enforce this better, because all of these rides, for the most part, are going to be met with like jail and arrests and violence and all this other stuff coming out of it. As another way to emphasize just how important the media is, there is another thing that happens in 1961, and it's generally recognized as one of the bigger failures in the civil rights movement, largely because of the way the media is restricted on it. So this is also related to buses. It was a call for desegregating bus terminals. MLK actually shows up in Albany to help out with this movement. He's arrested along with a bunch of others for not dispersing. That's a pretty common thing. MLK and other protesters get arrested a lot. However, the local government in Albany was really good at keeping these violations out of the public view. The police did not use violence in any real way. They just arrested people that didn't draw the press in then because there's no violence to report on. It's just people being arrested. And especially when you have stuff like the Freedom Rides kind of taking center stage, who's going to pay attention that much to some protesters getting arrested in Albany, but there was no violence that happened from it? Especially when MLK decides that because the press isn't showing up, he's going to leave, which he does get a lot of criticism for. But realistically, like, MLK's biggest weapon during the civil rights movement is his fame. The MLK draws the press in. If the press aren't in Albany, MLK sticking around is not going to make that protest be more effective. MLK needs to go where the media is because that's where they're going to see results. That's at least MLK's reasoning. Whereas people that get mad at him would say that, he abandoned them and how dare he do that. And it becomes an issue of contention with some people during the civil rights movement. But this is a clear sign of how important that media attention is, because there's not going to be sympathy from the nation. There's not going to be huge changes from Albany. And again, it's viewed as a pretty big failure of the civil rights movement, mostly because the media doesn't show up. Also, something I just noticed that I've never noticed before, this picture, there's a sign that says Hitler's love life revealed. This got absolutely nothing to do with the civil rights movement, but what? Okay. So we're going to jump ahead. We're going to kind of skip over 1962 here. For our purposes, nothing really super significant is going to happen there. We're going to hop to something that surprisingly I haven't seen come up specifically too often on the IB exam, but it's an incredibly important event, and I'm amazed that it's something that you can use in answering a lot of questions, but it's not something that comes up specifically in like their layout of like what you should talk about or what you should know. But you should definitely know this. So we're going to talk about it anyway. 1963 is when Birmingham happens. You can see in this picture over here that Birmingham is not a huge fan of integration. They very much like things to remain segregated. In fact, in 1963, Birmingham, Alabama was considered the most segregated city in all of America. And considering, that we had looked at, for example, that map of the Deep South when it came to Brown v. Board, how those Deep South states, none of them had integrated by, the 1960, it was the 1960 on there, timeline of that map. So being the most segregated in an environment like that is pretty impressive in a very grotesque and horrible way. So MLK decides, if you are going to try to tackle segregation, why not start at the top? Go with the place that is the most segregated and try to deal with that first. So he's going to plan with a bunch of other groups, starting at the local level in Birmingham, a bunch of boycotts of downtown stores and attempts at integrating local churches. Remember, SCLC is a religious organization. So he's going to push for this, and he's going to get arrested, as we see in a lot of these protests that occur. MLK gets arrested many, many times, like we saw in Albany just a minute ago. So the official justification for his arrest here is that there was an injunction placed banning the protests. So they had actually gotten their permits to protest, which you do need, by the way. You have the right to protest, but you got to get a permit for it. They had the proper protests. The local government said, no, you can't protest here. We're putting an injunction in place. MLK and his group said, I don't care. We're doing it anyway. MLK gets arrested. While he's in prison, he writes a letter from Birmingham jail, which is one of the most well-known pieces of civil rights literature. It's become an incredibly common example of like very powerful and effective persuasive writing. So even in prison, he's doing a lot of really important stuff. And again, getting that massive media attention from this because a letter from Birmingham jail is published for the nation to see. MLK is released on bail a week after. Let me see if I have... Okay, we're going to have to do that point here. That hold on, coughing. So apparently, while he was in prison, MLK also shot a album cover here on the right here. That's a joke, by the way, in case it wasn't obvious. Obviously, it's not an album, but that looks like an album cover, okay? But anyway, MLK's in jail, and in fact, in Birmingham, there are so many people arrested, they actually turn it into a strategy for the civil rights movement. Basically, what they decide is, all right, they're going to try to arrest us to shut down our protest. They can't arrest all of us. What are they going to do when they arrest so many people that there's no more room in their prisons? It turns out the answer is use prisons in nearby counties. But even then, there's a limit to how many people you could arrest, right? So the civil rights movement decides to use that not court packing, that's a different thing, jail packing scheme here. This is another area where MLK sometimes gets some criticism. I'm going to bring up a few of these because I think it's important to recognize that even people who are heroes and are generally idolized maybe sometimes make some ill-informed or unfair choices. So the reason why MLK catches flack here is because he encourages this. And for MLK, it's easy because remember, going back to our last slide here, he's released on bail after a week. What about all the other people that get arrested? Some of them are going to be like, they're going to have support from NAACP or maybe from the SCLC. Maybe there's going to be like fundraising to get their bail raised for them. But a lot of those people, they don't have the resources to get out of jail and to fight those charges the same way that MLK does. So they are giving up a lot more than he is to do this. Now, of course, again, to give the argument from MLK's side, he's not making them get arrested. They're choosing to do it. They know the risk. They know what's going on with it. But there are people that kind of criticize him for that. This slide is the last kind of big thing that we're going to talk about him getting criticized for. And this one, I have a much harder time arguing in favor of MLK for. This one might be the only one where I agree that I don't like how he did this. But basically, Birmingham becomes a big focus because of how violent and how big it gets. I mentioned with Orville Faubus that he was like one of our dudes that could be a physical manifestation of racism and hatred. Even more so than Orville Faubus is this dude, Bull Connor. Bull Connor is the guy who's in charge of the police on this protest. Oh, I just noticed that the lecture program I'm using cuts off the bottom of this. Well, I'll tell you what it says when we get there. So Bull Connor is going to organize the police in a very specific way, which is violence. They are going to, for example, use high-pressure fire hoses. We're talking about fire hoses that if you open them up on a tree, it could actually tear the bark off of a tree. I don't know about you, but my skin is slightly easier to tear off than bark is. So just imagine what that could do to human flesh. They also have trained police dogs, which they are going to use on the protesters and attack them. When the protesters would fall down, either from the hoses or, trying to hold off the dogs or just, because police are charging them, the police would beat them with nightsticks, which would be their clubs, and take them to jail. So obviously a huge amount of violence is going on here. And as we have seen previously, this violence gets a lot of media attention and it actually works in favor of the civil rights protesters. Now, MLK at this point and all the protesters for the most part know this. They know to expect violence. They know that it's going to get really bad. And they're hoping for that in some way because that's going to get that media attention, which gets public support for them. The area where MLK kind of comes under fire a little bit is knowing all this, as we see on the picture on the left here. MLK makes a very morally dubious decision. He knowingly chooses to bring children into the protests because what's going to get you more support in the public than children protesting and being attacked like this. Now, obviously, he doesn't want these children to get hurt, although some of them do end up being part of the violence that occurs here. And there is something to be said for the idea of like that is going to get a lot more support for the civil rights movement. But I have a hard time stomaching the idea of using children for anything. Other civil rights protesters, they get to make an informed choice, right? They know the danger they're going into. But children are not like fully mentally developed. They actually can't make that informed choice on a mental level. That is why, for example, children are not allowed to give consent because they are not mentally able to do so. Yeah, the idea of sending children into an area where you know there's going to be violence, I'm not too hot on that one. So for the most part, MLK, awesome dude, but maybe not when it comes to sending children in to violent protest or, violent counter protest in Birmingham. That is, by the way, what the bottom down here says, is some of them were involved in the violence. So that's what the physical representation of racism looks like right there. Bull Connor. Orville Faubus was pretty racist in what he did, but at the end of the day, his core ideology wasn't like necessarily racist. He was actually kind of viewed as a moderate when it came to, that area of the U.S. Bull Connor, though, was just, man, did this guy hate black people. So, yeah, Bull Connor, super duper racist. This is another opportunity where I like to talk about expectations and common understandings and the importance of really fact-checking sources, because this is something I didn't even know about until a couple of years ago. And I really wish we could do this as a class because it's so much more effective to do it as a class activity. And usually I would start out by asking you, what do you know about this photo? It's a pretty famous photo, so you might know something about it. And usually what I hear, because it's the way this picture has been presented, is that's a protester at Birmingham. And this is evidence that he is being attacked by trained police dogs, which we know happened. And, he's clearly being nonviolent there. And he's just, this police officer's coming in, grabbing him by the shirt and just attacking him. However, that is not what happened here. So this guy is referred to as the foot soldier of Birmingham. And, I want to say it was like 1991 or something. I believe it was the 1990s. There was a statue called the Foot Soldier of Birmingham that was created in Birmingham as a way to kind of remember this action. And this picture was used as the inspiration for that statue. And as a result, somebody decided to do something that apparently nobody had thought of before. They were like, hey, we should track down the protester, this guy in this photo, and interview him to commemorate the release of this statue. So they find this guy and they interview him and they find out some interesting things. Number one, he wasn't a protester. The interviewer, you could actually listen to the interview. It's online. If you want to let me know and I could send it your way. The interviewer asks him, he goes, so when did you get involved in the civil rights movement? And the guy goes, I wasn't. And he goes, oh, well, your family was, right? Or your church was or something. He goes, no, I didn't know anybody that was involved in the civil rights movement. I was a high school student. So this guy was a high school student. His family actually forbid him from going to this protest. He was just curious. He heard that MLK was coming to town. He knew there was going to be a big protest. He wanted to see what it was all about. But his family said, no, you can't go to that. You've got school. It's going to be violent. You are not allowed to go. He actually skipped out on school. He got in big trouble with his parents. They found out about it because he wanted to see what was going down at this protest. So he goes there and he's watching the protests kind of evolve. And he starts realizing that he's standing right in the path that the protesters are coming down and all the violence is happening. So he decides he's going to get out of the way. He goes across the street. He's still watching what's happening. And he accidentally walks into this police line here. When he walks into that police line, the dog here gets startled and attacks on its own. If you look at this picture, even if we didn't have that the interview of him saying it himself, there's evidence for that. Look at the posture here. This police officer is pulling away. He's stepping back, his arms at a right angle. The leash here is taut. He's trying to hold the dog back. This police officer is actually trying to get the dog off of this dude. Apparently, the reason why he's grabbing his shirt here is because he's trying to guide him away from the police line. He just wants him to go back around this way where these other black people are standing. He doesn't want him going through the street. The dog gets startled, it jumps up. So both of these guys are like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And they're startled. This is not actually a case of police violence. Police violence did occur on a very large scale in Birmingham, but this particular picture is not that. This picture became massively popular. It was on the cover of Time magazine. It became kind of like the symbol of Birmingham. And it's not about a civil rights protester or about police violence. In fact, this guy, if anything, has some pretty unfortunate racial views, because when he was asked what he thought about the new statue, as you can see here, he said it made him look too black and he didn't like it. So this is an interesting photo to have become the kind of symbol of Birmingham, because basically everything we know about it is wrong. So just thought I'd throw that out there. So that being said, as I mentioned, violence did definitely occur here. So we actually have the fire department here, Birmingham Fire Department, that's BFD, opening up those fire hoses on these protesters. Again, they're just asking for integration. So this is going to eventually work out in favor of the protesters. Ooh, sorry, thought that was a cough, and it was not a cough. That's very embarrassing. But I'm also like 30 minutes into this, so you guys just get to deal with that. So the city leaders are eventually going to agree to end segregation when it comes to those local businesses, which is what all this started about in the first place. As we have seen in previous examples of things going right for the civil rights movement, this causes a lot of anger and backlash with some groups, for example, the KKK. And when the KKK gets angry, they do what they do as a terrorist organization. They carry out terrorist attacks. And the terrorist attack that is carried out in Birmingham is the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. The KKK sets off a bomb at this church. The church was not empty, although the church was not in session at the time, but there were 4 young girls that were there who were killed in the blast. And obviously, if we're talking about people supporting the civil rights movement, this kind of thing gets a huge amount of support through. This is actually a massive factor in getting the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, because of the public backlash and the pressure that puts on politicians to do something about it. But an absolute tragedy of 4 children getting murdered because the KKK is mad that local businesses integrated. So that's the 16th Street Baptist Church before the bombing. You can see, obviously, not from the same angle. This is from the side, the aftermath of the bombing. These are the 4 children that were killed. 3 of them were 14, 1 was 11. And they were all murdered by the KKK because of integration. So obviously the impact of this can be seen pretty well. This picture is actually from a march in DC done by CORE. And you can see their sign right here, "No More Birminghams," using that exact same photo I showed you guys earlier. And kind of the final note to wrap up this PowerPoint on, pay attention to the composition of this crowd. There is still obviously a very large number of black people in here, but we're very rapidly getting to the point where like 1/3 to 1/2 of these people are white, are non-black. So the public support for this movement has rapidly grown from 1955, Montgomery Bus Boycott, you're pretty much only seeing black protesters there, to 1963, we've got a very mixed group of protesters here in DC demanding change. So we'll see on part 2 how that all kind of shapes up and wraps up. Thank you guys for sitting through my coughing and my nasally voice, and everything else is coming with this cold. I should be back on Thursday to actually, do stuff. Bye.